Hi, following on the previous video, let's check out some more of these games that define their subgenres. Be it regular or exotic, they all had to become what they are at some point. I'm brave, so I'll say this. FMV games were never really known for their quality, despite many of them being actually pretty good. It's because most, especially those that came out in the early to mid-90s, when CD drives found their way under our roofs, banked on making a quick buck with shoddy releases, overfilled with digitized videos and no substance. These are not the titles that we'll talk about today. The first two FMV games that I can think of would be Astron Belt and Dragon's Lair, both released in 1983 and both were originally arcade-only laserdisc games. First was a space-themed action shooter that streamed its sequences in real time, and the other was an action-adventure, well, an interactive movie really, which followed a knight Dirk on his quest to save the Princess Daphne. That said, it's two other titles that come to mind when I think about FMV games that redefined their genre, that set the standards for it, for all the other games to strive to, are 1994's Under a Killing Moon and 1995's Phantasmagoria. But while Phantasmagoria is a very creepy, atmospheric and dark story, it's definitely not a game for everyone, especially because of numerous pointless deaths and the fact that its story really makes no sense. I mean, take away its gameplay and just think about it. It's plain silly. Under a Killing Moon, on the other hand, is fantastic. Not only it's interesting and captivating to follow, but it's also set in a post-apocalyptic / post-World War III San Francisco, which is something I adored about it. It served a dark humor-filled PI story that places you in the shoes of a morose and unlucky Tex Murphy who unintentionally finds himself in the middle of the mystery that has to be unraveled. Killing Moon's mix of 3D textured environments exploration, adventure game backbone with digitized full-motion video with real actors' cinematics made it a memorable title and one that set a benchmark for many others to follow. On-rail shooters are an odd genre. They are excellent with light guns in the arcades, pretty decent with a mouse, if you have a good one that is, and god-awful with box-standard controllers. Well, at least those that most of us consider on-rail shooters today, so games where the camera moves around environments automatically at intervals, the enemies run or shoot at you, so at the screen, and where you control a crosshair, annihilating everything that moves. Well, short of civilians, but that's kinda obvious, isn't it? If you think about it though, the genre actually started with 1985's Space Harrier and a second of Sega's classics, 1987's Afterburner. These two, while definitely running on rail, were made to use standard controls and henceforth were much easier to convert to numerous home systems of yore. And while the same could be said about SNES's iconic Star Fox, I believe that it was 1994's Virtua Cop that laid out the framework for what we mostly consider as on-rail shooters today. So a gameplay loop comprised of larger levels split into smaller static areas overflowing with bodies, between which the game takes us automatically. The enemies need to be removed, preferably with an accurate shot between the eyes or the balls, whichever of these you can take faster, and all that before the indicators around them quote-unquote close, so that they would not get a chance to shoot at you. It's a very simple and yet instantly recognizable mechanic that's a staple of the genre to this day. The introduction of additional, more powerful and hidden in the crates weapons and occasional end-level bosses is also something that we've grown to expect and appreciate as they keep the gameplay more fun. Olympic Decathlon, also known as Microsoft Decathlon from 1980, is technically the very first Olympic sports game ever. It featured all 10 Decathlon events, and for the time that it released in, it was a rather interesting product. Well, at least until 1983, when Activision dropped their take on the Decathlon, by taking everything that the earlier game did and making it look better and smoother running. Like a lot better and a lot smoother. Especially that it was an arcade and not a text game. But ultimately it was 1984 and 85, Epic's summer and winter games respectively, that truly started off and defined the entire genre of dozens of games that released throughout the next decade. They took what Activision's game did, split it into two kinds of Olympic games, picked interesting and fun to compete in disciplines, and coupled them with superb for the time presentation. They've also introduced the infamous joystick flipping controls for some of the events, which, while terrible for both joysticks and your wrists, were hella easy to understand, demanding to master, and a lot of fun when experienced in a group of friends playing competitively. I mean, it's gotta be said that the arguments who'll get to use which joystick and why, while also always present when playing these games, were part of the fun and what you near always expected to happen. The events were mostly, with a few exceptions, different from one another, requiring different skills to be good at, which meant that even in the most uneven group of gamers, everyone could be good at something. By today's standards, first Virtua Fighter is very crude. Its characters are made out of low-poly flat-shaded polygons, and the 3D environments that the fights take place in are no more than a flat ring with 2D JPEG-looking backgrounds. But despite its shortcomings, it was a very notable release. It was the first good 3D fighter with a unique and fun-to-play cast of characters, most of which used real martial arts-inspired moves and attacks, and it was definitely a thinking man's game, requiring you to play strategically, chaining moves one after another rather than mashing keys on random or spamming the same attack. Simply put, its importance in the history of gaming is unquestionable. Despite not being a fan of it, I believe that it's Tekken 3 that became the genre setter when it comes to 3D fighters, however. It iterated on its own 2 earlier entries and 3 previous Virtua Fighter games, and created a truly unique and spectacular versus fighting experience. It was the first game to truly take use of the 3D design of it by introducing a more fluid and dynamic movement system. It allowed for sidestepping and moving about the stage in a more natural manner, which meant that you no longer had to take that kick to the chin or a kidney punch and could strategically step aside in the right moment, then conk your opponent in the noggin or fire uppercut someone straight into the KO like a boss. All these changes, along with Tekken's iconic rather flashy and explosive attacks and combos and a stellar cast of characters, made it not only a noteworthy addition to the genre but also a star that many other games tried to reach the heights of. The first ever submarine simulation that I can think of is ZX Spectrum's 1983's Hunter Killer. And while it's obviously a very simple game today, it was surprisingly complex for the time it released in. Granted, it only featured 3 screens, control room, periscope and chart room, but you were leading a British escape submarine hunting U-boats, which is always fun. Arguably the best classic sim though is SSI's 1996 Silent Hunter, which puts you inside the US sub in the Pacific Theater around the end of World War II. I've never been in a submarine myself, but I consider Silent Hunter being a very realistic experience, as much as I could imagine at least. The most important game in the genre though would probably have to be 1990's Silent Service 2. It is also set in a Pacific theater and pits you against the Japanese fleet on the Pacific Ocean. It featured all the rooms and most instruments found in a real sub, realistic torpedo physics, 9 types of different submarines to choose from, 10 types of torpedoes and 14 different Japanese ships. And all that sounding and looking like the real thing. What's more, Silent Service 2 also comes with 7 realistic missions based on true US naval engagements from the time. You know what? I think I wanna give the hyperspeed sci-fi racer genre-defining spot to 2 games. A joint award, if you will. I know, I shouldn't, but it's not something that will become a habit, hear me out. I'm sure you know what 2 games I have in mind, so before I get to them, I'd like to give an honorable mention to Star Wars Episode 1 Racer from 1999, which while not a game that defined anything, it still was a perfect example of an excellent racer and one of the literally only couple of good things that came out of George Lucas's The Phantom Menace. The other one being Jar Jar Binks, and I mean it, the monstrosity was responsible for so many great memes. Anyway, the 2 genre setters in question are naturally 1990's F-Zero and 1995's Wipeout. The first literally kicked off the genre and done it in style, speed and fun factor no one expected it to. Utilizing SNES's famous Mode 7, the game looked pseudo-3D, so more modern than anyone expected out of a small home system at the time. The speed boost, traps and repair areas were an interesting inclusion too, and something that the genre would later be known for, in one form or another. And Wipeout? Well, Wipeout took all of it and made it perfect. It took a cloth and worked so hard on the polishing of the formula that when it was done, it shined like a bald man's scalp. First of all and most importantly, it did 2 things. Moved the game to true and beautiful full 3D for both vehicle models and tracks, and also bumped the pace at which you were racing at a notch or 2 too, raising the sensation of speed to previously unknown to gamers levels. And the addition of various weapons, shields, pickups and a banging soundtrack made this originally a PlayStation debut by Psygnosis a system seller. The first ever top-down racer, at least as far as we know, is the 1974's Ground Track 10. Now, I'm sure that in the early 70s it may have looked spectacular and futuristic, but today, well, I mean, I love my retro games and all, but I wouldn't want to play this any longer than a couple of minutes. Anyway, the first game I considered for the spot here was 1983's Rally Speedway. It originally released on an 8-bit Atari and then C64, and it even back then had the most features we expect from a good game in the genre. So a simultaneous 2-player mode, incredibly fast cars, sharp corners and even a track editor. not to mention a super cute driver rolling on the ground to put out the fire that he's on animation after each and every crash. But most of all, it was hella fun to play if you had someone to compete against. But truth be told, the game that is a true genre-defining title is the one that you all expected to see here, Micro Machines. Say what you want about it, but it was a near-perfect title for the fans of the top-down racing gameplay loop. It featured many different unlockable vehicles, each naturally performing differently, dozens of different stages, all set in fun and interesting locations in and around the house, so a snooker table, kitchen, workshop, sandbox and the likes. And trust me when I say that, they are all super fun to race around on. What's more, you get to choose who you play as, and while the characters don't really differ in anything when you're driving as them, when the CPU is in control though, they all have their own unique styles and on-track behavior. The game that I've picked as a business simulation genre-defining title released quite late in 1995, so it was hardly the first. And many other awesome titles dropped before. Stuff like 1980's Free Mule, that was a mixture of a party board game with planetary resource management and economic simulation. A sci-fi multiplayer romp like no other at the time. Or even my personal favorite, Ports of Call, that mixed a rather fun even if not too deep sea shipping company management with arcade ship steering scenes in which you either had to save a stranded sailor, avoid a collision course with another ship, navigate around icebergs, or even dock and undock from ports. It was great. 1992's The Patrician was a game that ticked nearly all the boxes too, allowing you to build and grow a sprawling trade empire in the medieval times. But eventually I decided on Transport Tycoon Deluxe. It perhaps didn't touch trading at all, but the entire business running team of it, the balancing of your incomes and expenditure, and potential cornering of the transport market with either new, better and faster vehicles or previously not transported commodities made it an incredible game in more than one way. It may have looked like SimCity 2000, but played entirely different, pitting you against a few unrelating and always cheating CPU opponents that were a blast to beat. All of that made Transport Tycoon Deluxe a one-of-a-kind title that many others tried to follow since, and very few managed to. When in 1983 Spy Hunter released in the arcades and then promptly after on most home systems, the world changed forever. No longer racing and shooting were separate genres. No, we could have them both rolled into one, and with style and fun gameplay to boot, no less. But fun or not, it is not my choice. And neither is 1994's Road Rush that I spent so much time playing, kicking other racers off their bikes and zooming to the finish line as if nothing had ever happened, you wouldn't believe. It was not even my favorite, Carmageddon, because despite being mostly about vehicle destruction and making sure that the streets were entirely free of pedestrians, it still relied heavily on the racing to the finish line. Sure, the whole racing thing could be ignored and the race could be won simply by becoming the last one driving, but it still was designed as the race. 1995's Twisted Metal, however, laser focused on combat and combat alone, and to win you had to be the one surviving all the other drivers. It was not an option, it was a requirement. Twisted Metal featured 6 combat tracks, 12 drivers, each with a different vehicle, and numerous weapons to pick up while driving and spread death and destruction with. And boy oh boy, was it fun. Sure, I still prefer Carmageddon, but if you like vehicular combat games at all, you're not gonna get bored playing Twisted Metal. What it's set up to do, it did well, and set a benchmark for its own genre for years to come. Now, I'd like to preface it by saying that I don't consider strictest city builders to be settlement simulations, even though they technically are. But they had a separate entry in the previous video, so if you're interested in these, seek them out there. The earliest settlement management game, however, is also one of the oldest games that I've ever heard about. It's the Sumerian game that released on huge-ass mainframe computers in 1964. Yes, a few years before the moon landing. It's naturally an entirely text-based title, and it has you ruling a Sumerian city-state of Lagash. In essence, it's all about making series of mostly economic choices and then seeing their positive or otherwise consequences. And while it was an ambitious game, it was not genre-defining in any shape or form. Because the one that was, at least in my eyes, released 29 years later on Amiga and a year after on PC. And it was Blue Byte Software's Brilliant Settlers. Holy cow, what a sight it was to my young eyes seeing it run on my friend's Amiga and all those tiny citizens cutting down the trees, planting crops, fishing, or even building structures plank by plank. It was like seeing the snow for the first time. So while I knew that's how the settlements worked in the past, seeing it all come to life was truly eye-opening and one-of-a-kind experience at the time. Settlers was not just a visual treat though, and most of all, it was a series of multiple chains of supply and demands, correlations between different workplaces, and micromanagement hell. I mean, heaven. Micromanagement heaven, because it not only done it first, but it also did so perfectly that it inspired dozens of games that followed, and many still do to this very day. While 1981's Defender's gameplay loop of protecting the Earth from the invading alien forces, composed out of surprisingly varied number of enemies, was quite fun for the time and an all-time arcade classic, it was definitely not a game that we would consider to be the one to cement the genre characteristics for the future titles to base on. I mean, sure, it did scroll horizontally, and you did pilot a ship shooting at numerous bodies, but everything about it was rather basic and lacking sophistication. Now R-Type on the other hand, well, that game did set foundations for everything that came after. It introduced nearly everything that we've seen in other games in the genre for decades to come. So numerous powerful and differently working weapons, charging shot, homing missiles, weapon spot that acts kinda like a satellite following your ship and can be used both offensively by shooting and defensively by tanking the enemy bullets. What's more, all stages had a very unique to them design, very Geiger-like feeling, and the bosses were rather big and fun to figure out the pattern of to beat. It also was not a game that would require a memorization of the levels layouts, and you were fine taking it as it was for as long as your reflexes were up to snuff. R-Type may have not been the first, but it was definitely, at least for a while, the most important game in the genre. I could say that 1980s Rogue started, defined and created the entire roguelike genre, and I would be technically correct. It was indeed the first, the genre's even using its name to describe a particular set of gameplay mechanics, and everything that it did, all the other games that came after do too, in a more or less similar way. But for this entry, I would like to focus on a game that did not define, but redefine the genre, staying faithful to the ideas behind it, to the gameplay style, and to feeling of being a lone brave, scouring endless dungeons and facing hundreds of deadly creatures warrior, using magic and numerous different weapons, seeking treasures, fame and adventure. And that title, ladies and gentlemen, released 31 years after Rogue. Dungeons of Dreadmore was what I saw when playing Rogue first. So all the letters that were used for creatures and items were finally really those creatures and items, and the adventure that you were on when playing gained a lot with having its graphics be high resolution, detailed and beautifully animated. It was naturally also a full point-and-click experience that sounded amazing and had a very well-made random dungeons generation system, making sure that each playthrough was unique and one of a kind. The systems of 2011 were naturally incomparably more powerful than those of 1980, so the number of features and content that Dreadmore brought to the table dwarfed what Rogue originally did, even if under its hood it was the very same ASCII characters moving game, only brought into 21st century standards. Well, undoubtedly it's Xidius that spawned the entire vertically scrolling shooter genre, setting the stone for what it would become, so featuring a player-controlled aircraft flying over the Earth as opposed to space, and facing number of both air and land-based enemies, for disposing of which you were equipped with different weapons. I don't believe that it was the title worth calling genre-defining. It was not even released later the very same year, Fantastic River Raid, as it was a bit of an offshoot of a traditional mold of the genre. And worst of all, it was not even my most favorite shooter of all time, Deluxe Galaga, aka Warblade. Despite being the most genius, fun and innovative take on the classic Galaga ever. It didn't scroll though, so it couldn't be the one either. What did define a modern take on a vertical shooter though, was 2001's Ikaruga. It took everything that Xidius did and expanded upon it. It morphed back land and air weapons into one, but split them into two separate and differing in color firing modes, black and white, and built the entire gameplay loop around that notion. So the enemies and bosses shoot these bullets, and your ship has two sides, one for each color. When switching to the one that the bullet traveling at you is, you render your ship immune to the shots, so a fast and correct color swap operation is a big part of a gameplay strategy in Ikaruga. Opposite color bullets naturally kill you instantly, same as in other shooters, so you gotta be careful. Since you get to shoot these colored bullets too, whenever you hit the enemy with an opposing color, your shots do twice as much damage. This, combined with the patterns that the enemies come at you, made Ikaruga a truly genre-defining game and one of the most original games made in it. I am not sure how correct it is, but I feel that 720 Degrees released in 1986 was the first quote-unquote extreme sports game. But while it may have been the first, it was not something that we could consider genre setting. Neither was a years later Skate or Die, which happened to be a much better game than that first. Still a skateboard game and still quite fun. In fact, the title that I consider the genre-defining one, even if far from the best, is the first Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. It laid the groundwork for a fun, action-packed sports title to just jump into and play, but also required a lot of skill to master. It featured 9 real-life skaters, including Tony Hawk himself, numerous different stages covered with ramps, rails, halfpipes and anything you could imagine as a good base to pull off some of those sick tricks on, and 2 addictive and fun gameplay modes. First, saw you skating around different real-life locations, completing fun little goals in them, like smashing objects, going for the high score or collecting items for instance. And these goals earned you videotapes and unlocked new skateboards and levels. The second game mode was a competition in which you had to attempt getting high scores in an allotted time by performing often daring tricks. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater may not be the best game in the genre, but it's definitely one all the others looked up to, whether they were about skateboarding, snowboarding, speedboating or anything else. 1999 was a year that arena shooters genre was born. And it spawned in an interesting way, with 3 titles appearing more or less at the same time and offering very similar gameplay loop. Unreal Tournament dropped on November 22nd, Turok Rage Wars on November 23rd, and Quake 3 Arena on December 2nd. And somehow they all mostly went for the same gameplay design, comprising of offering deathmatch type of a gameplay on numerous arenas, using many weapons and against either bots or better yet other players. Now that's naturally a gross oversimplification, as they offered different fun modes too, some of them specific to particular games only. But they all relied on fast-paced action, quick kills and respawns, and gathering as high kill counts as possible. While one of these 3, Turok, is definitely an outlier, having released on N64 only and henceforth having a much narrower user base and only maximum of 4 players combating against each other at once, the other 2 are very difficult to choose between and both have their own diehard fans that swear by them. Personally, I couldn't have picked my fave if you ask me. I've played both for a little while and found them very similar gameplay-wise. But before you rush to comment that they're completely different and I have no idea what I'm talking about, please remember that I'm not an avid FPS gamer and Arena 1 even less so. So, I've elected not to pick a game that defined the genre. They all did, neither of them have, or maybe the genre spawned into existence on its own volition. Whatever. Let's agree that 1999 was when all of the genre's characteristics were magically defined. 1989's Mech was the first Battletech game released on home systems and also first ever mech game too. It featured a first-person perspective gameplay and a surprisingly decent plot of revenge, to fulfilling of which you're slowly getting by forging relationships with 5 different houses ruling the so-called inner sphere and seeking people responsible for your family's untimely demise. All the missions are generated randomly and you can buy and sell mechs, repair them and even hire and fire pilots for them too. MechWarrior was definitely a genre setter and a game that outlined what was expected from the other titles releasing in it in the future. That said, I believe it's worth to mention a completely different game here too. One that redefined that notion and remade it into what we expect from a more action and less simulation-oriented offshoot of it. So, 1997's Armored Core. It's obvious that 8 years, and especially in such an explosive time of progress like the late 80s and mid-90s, was a lot of time, and that both games cannot be compared in terms of their presentation whatsoever, so I will only cover the mechanical differences between them. Armored Core changed the viewpoint into a third-person one and removed something many of the MechWarrior fans would consider a blasphemy. So realism. No longer the mechs were these heavy lumps of steel moving about like an overgrown metal T-Rexes. Nope, they were fast, agile and zooming around the game world at incredibly high speeds. What's more, players could modify their mechs in countless ways with a wide variety of parts and weapons, customizing their gameplay experience to suit their playstyle. Mech combat games are an interesting genre, as the duality in it, introduced by these completely different playing games, makes it the most yin-yangy feeling genre out of all in today's video, but also one of the most interesting ones too. Before I tell you about my pick for the boxing games genre, especially that it's gonna be a bit controversial given how obscure it is, I'd like to briefly mention 2 other notable releases, as they both deserve a mention. Chronologically first is the 1976's Heavyweight Champ, which was the first boxing game ever made. It released in the arcades and featured an interesting glove-like controller that could be moved up and down for high and low punches. It was a crude game in all of its aspects, but given when it released, I bet that it was something that the gamers were going crazy over. And the second is the arcade release of Punch-Out and its later re-release on NES as Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. It's a very arcade take on the sport, and one that required a memorization of attack and movement patterns of all the opponents rather than strategy. Not a bad game, mind you, just not very technical. Now, 4D sports boxing, an ugly-looking and sounding 1991's release, is completely different to the aforementioned two. It aimed to recreate the sport in full detail, and it first and foremost banked on the realism, making the bouts considerably slower, but on the flip side much more strategic, letting you move around the entire 3D ring to avoid the opponent's attacks. It takes you through the entire title run and pits you against more and more demanding challengers, all the way allowing you to train between the fights to improve the stats of your fighter. While 4D sports boxing is not a great looking game, sporting very early 3D graphics, the character movement, range of attacks and the way it plays made it a game that set a bar for future titles to follow. Now this is the most difficult subgenre to cover, at least for me, because of how unclear it is. So let me explain what I understand as a cinematic action-adventure. It's a genre that covers games that are primarily action-oriented, packing and serving a lot of punch, usually spanning long playthrough times and very deep lore, coupled with captivating plots worthy of movies or serialized TV release. They are also very often mixed with other genres like point-and-click adventures or RPGs, to name a few. I've initially considered Uncharted Drake's Fortune, the first game in its series, to be the one to fit the criteria, given how similar to Indiana Jones it is and how fun and Daredevil-worthy stunts-filled of an adventure it is. But it's just an extension of the original Tomb Raider idea, which means that I would have to consider the latest Lara Croft trilogy too, as it's made in a near-identical style while featuring arguably more iconic protagonist. Well, definitely one with a bigger chest. So I moved my attention to The Last of Us. Naughty Dog's masterpiece that perfected the genre to the heights not seen before. And it's a great choice too, but it's a game that was a culmination of the genre growing into what it is today and not something that set it all up. And then it hit me, and I know that I'm right, even if you disagree. But the choice was obvious despite the severe technical and design limitations of the first game in this epic and arguably groundbreaking trilogy, Mass Effect. But I'm considering them as a whole, all three of them starting with the first. Many if not most things we expect from the genre started off with Mass Effect. Its story was grander than life itself and encompassed an entire galaxy, taking 3 games to conclude. It involved many different spacefaring races and an enemy so powerful that standing against it seemed impossible. But most importantly, a hero that was not born one and had to grow into who he eventually became. It was an epos like no other, and countless games and series tried to mimic the formula, regardless of their overarching themes. It goes without saying that it was Breakout that was the first ever Brick Breaker game. And given when it released, it was a pretty fun one for its time too. It introduced the standard level layout of bricks being arranged in patterns at the top of the screen and a paddle at the bottom. And gameplay comprised of destroying the bricks for points by bouncing the ball at them with a paddle. The idea was solid, but it lacked something. And 1986's Arkanoid fixed that. Well, it was not broken, so there was nothing to fix really, but it built on the original idea, creating a truly addicting formula that countless games after followed and iterated upon. First of all, it added different kinds of bricks and arranged them in unique ways, making each and every next level more interesting and often demanding than the previous was. Secondly, it brought in power-ups, at the time known from many other games like shooters. And these were a whole manner of different things, from ball multiplier through sticky paddle that stopped the ball when it touched it and allowed you to launch it on your own in more or less direction of your choosing, all the way to the twin cannons among others that were hella helpful at clearing the screens at high pace. Sounds and graphics were also lifted to what the audiences expected in the mid-80s. And if I'm to be honest, even if we'd get no other games in the genre, and we did, quite a few actually, like the fantastic DX Ball for instance, even Arkanoid alone, with no follow-ups to its name, would be a plenty amazing game. I'm convinced that 1984's Dragon Slayer was the first ever hack-and-slash game. I mean, sure, it was hella simple, and the hacking and slashing was more like bumping into the enemies, but other than that, the entire loop of killing bodies and collecting loot was there and worked just fine. So Power Stones increased your strength, coins did the same with HP, and experience points determined the maximum amount of HP you were able to get. There were also some rudimentary spells, but they were mostly used as utility outside of combat. Still, the foundations were there, and it was a noteworthy game. 1985's Gauntlet simplified some of these mechanics, but it expanded on combat and exploration, making the game feel bigger and more interesting to traverse through. It also featured 4 different characters, each with their own class. The difference between them was limited and only really came down to 2 of them attacking at melee range and 2 at distance, but it was not nothing. Enter Diablo, Blizzard's little surprise of a game that came out of nowhere and conquered the world. It gave you 3 entirely different looking and most importantly playing classes of Warrior, Rogue and Sorcerer, and a dungeon worth of adventures underneath the chapel of Town Tristram. It was filled with thousands of devil spawned creatures, numerous bosses big and small, and more items with randomly assigned stats than you could ever hope for. Also many different skills and spells, and hours upon hours of fun, composed of the ideas introduced by the earlier two games but lifted to the mid-90s Windows standards. So high-res, high-color, excellent sounding blast of a game. There is no doubt in my mind that while not being the first hack and slash ever, Diablo was the most important one of them all. How did you find this video, guys? Fun? Cringe? Neither? Make sure to let me know in the comments below. Also, hit those like and subscribe buttons to help with the algorithm and get more similar content recommendations. And if you hit the bell down there too, oh, you'll know straight away when I release something new, a cringe comment, occasional gas, or even a video too. Either way, thanks for watching and I'll see you soon.